Commanders involved in this historical event. These are all commanders who appeared throughout this operation. Bullet Operator Major General John B. Wogan, Commanding General, 13th Armored Division. Bullet Operator Lieutenant Colonel Clay E. McCullough, Battalion Commander, severely wounded during reconnaissance. Bullet Operator Lieutenant Colonel Delnor, Commanding Officer, 46th Tank Battalion, Task Force Commander. Bullet Operator Captain O'Malley, C Company Task Force Commander, 46th Tank Battalion. Bullet Operator Colonel Carlton H. Russell, Combat Command A Commander, 13th Armored Division. Bullet Operator Colonel Harris M. Molaski, Combat Command B Commander, 13th Armored Division. Bullet Operator Lieutenant General Alexander M. Patch, Commanding General, U.S. 7th Army. Bullet Operator General Lieutenant Hans Gustav Felber, Commander, German 7th Army, Remnants. Time, 0445 hours. Date, April 28, 1945. Location, approaches the Plattling in the Isar River, Bavaria, Germany. Weather, cold morning. Overcast skies turn into intermittent rain by midday. Temperature around 8 degrees C, 46 degrees Fahrenheit. Units involved, 13th Armored Division, U.S. Task Force Delnor, 46th Tank Battalion. C Company Task Force under Captain O'Malley, 801st Tank Destroyer Battalion, attached. 496th, 497th, 498th Armored Field Artillery Battalions, opposing German forces from remnants of 7th Army, with prepared defensive positions along the Isar River. The column of Sherman tanks and half-tracks moved through the pre-dawn darkness on April 28, 1945. Their crews bone-tired after crossing the swollen Danube River the previous day, and then enduring a 20-hour nightmare march through 30 miles of muddy Bavarian roads that had nearly broken the division's vehicles and spirit. Lieutenant Colonel Clay McCullough sat in his command half-track, somewhere in the middle of the column, studying maps by the dim light of a shielded flashlight, knowing that ahead lay the Isar River and the town of Plattling, and that intelligence reports indicated German forces had blown the bridges and were preparing defensive positions on the eastern bank. The division had been driving through southern Germany for weeks now, accepting mass surrenders one day and fighting desperate rearguard actions the next, never quite sure whether the next town would wave white flags or open fire with concealed anti-tank guns. Around him, soldiers slept sitting up in their vehicles or walked alongside in a daze, too exhausted to care about the cold rain that had started falling around 0300 hours. One tank commander, standing in his turret despite the weather, lit a cigarette and let the rain extinguish it before it could take a drag. He didn't bother lighting another. There was a limit to how much a man could fight against circumstances, and everyone had reached it days ago. Task Force Delnor, built around the 46th Tank Battalion and commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Delnor, had been designated as the lead element for the Isar River crossing operation, with Captain O'Malley's C Company Task Force assigned the mission of conducting initial reconnaissance and establishing a bridgehead if the tactical situation permitted. At 0515 hours, as the first gray light began showing in the eastern sky, Delnor's column halted approximately 3 kilometers west of Plattling, while 4 reconnaissance teams moved ahead to assess German positions and determine whether the river could be forced. The Isar wasn't a major river like the Danube they crossed the previous day, but it was wide enough and deep enough to require bridging equipment, and the spring rains had swollen it beyond normal levels, creating a fast current that would make any crossing under fire extremely dangerous. Captain O'Malley, sitting in his command tank at the head of his company, received orders over the radio at 0522. Move forward to observation positions overlooking Plattling and the Isar. Determine enemy strength and crossing feasibility. Report back by 0600. Simple orders for a mission that could turn deadly in seconds if German forces were watching the approaches. O'Malley's task force moved cautiously toward Plattling as dawn broke fully around 0545, the landscape revealing itself in shades of gray, rolling farmland giving way to the outskirts of an industrial town, factory smokestacks visible against low clouds, and beyond it all, the darker line of trees that marked the Isar River's course. At 0558, O'Malley's lead tank crested a low ridge that provided observation of Plattling's western approaches, and immediately the tactical picture became clear and ugly. The town's bridges were destroyed, twisted steel and broken concrete jutting from the water, German forces were dug in along the eastern bank. How many was impossible to determine, but movement was visible and defensive positions were obvious even at this distance. As O'Malley raised his binoculars to study the positions more carefully, German artillery opened fire. The first rounds impacted short, perhaps 200 meters in front of his position, but the ranging was quick and accurate. The second salvo was closer. The third salvo bracketed his entire company, shells exploding among his tanks and throwing up fountains of mud and shrapnel that rattled against armor like hail against a tin roof. Lieutenant Colonel McCullough had moved forward with the reconnaissance element, against the advice of his staff officers who argued that battalion commanders shouldn't expose themselves unnecessarily during preliminary reconnaissance. But McCullough believed in seeing tactical problems personally rather than relying on second-hand reports, and he positioned his half-track on the same ridge, where O'Malley's tanks were taking artillery fire. At 0604, a German shell landed within 10 meters of McCullough's vehicle. The explosion was catastrophic at that range. Shrapnel tore through the half-track's thin armor, wounding McCullough severely and killing his driver instantly. The battalion's executive officer, watching from a position slightly to the rear, saw the half-track disappear in smoke and flame, saw figures stumbling away from the wreckage, and immediately radioed for medics while simultaneously taking command of the reconnaissance operation. McCullough was pulled from the destroyed half-track with severe wounds to his legs and torso, bleeding heavily, conscious but in shock. A medic worked on him in a drainage ditch while German artillery continued falling, applying tourniquets and pressure bandages, doing battlefield medicine that was more about preventing death in the next 10 minutes than healing injuries that would require surgery and months of recovery. The German artillery fire that had wounded McCullough and destroyed his half-track was coming from positions on the eastern bank of the Isar, probably 105 mm guns positioned in the woods beyond Plattling, with pre-registered coordinates covering all the likely American approach routes. Captain O'Malley, now the senior officer still combat effective in the immediate area, made the tactical decision to withdraw his company from the exposed ridge and reposition in defilade where German observers couldn't direct fire effectively. As his tanks backed down the reverse slope, he radioed Lieutenant Colonel Delnor at the main task force position. Ridge overlook is under heavy artillery fire. McCullough is down, severe wounds, being evacuated. Enemy has blown all bridges over the Isar. Defensive positions observed on eastern bank with artillery support. Crossing will require engineers, smoke, artillery preparation, and accept casualties. This is not going to be easy. Delnor acknowledged the report and immediately began coordinating with Major General Wogan at division headquarters, laying out the tactical problem and requesting the resources necessary to force a crossing against prepared German defenses. By mid-morning, around 1030 hours, the 13th Armored Division had deployed forces around Plattling's western approaches and was preparing for a deliberate river crossing operation that would involve multiple combat arms working in careful coordination. The 801st Tank Destroyer Battalion, which had been attached to the division on April 27th, positioned their vehicles to provide long-range fire support across the river, their guns capable of engaging German positions on the eastern bank, even if they couldn't see specific targets through the trees and buildings. The 496th, 497th, and 498th Armored Field Artillery Battalions registered their guns on coordinates provided by forward observers, preparing fire missions that would suppress German defensive fires during the crossing itself. Combat engineers from the 124th Armored Engineer Battalion were brought forward with bridging equipment and assault boats, their commander conferring with infantry and armor officers about the best crossing sites and the sequence of operations. If you're seeing the complexity of what it takes to force a defended river crossing in 1945, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. We're documenting battles that most history books skip over entirely. The plan developed by Lieutenant Colonel Delnor and approved by Colonel Russell commanding Combat Command had called for a coordinated assault beginning at 1,400 hours. Artillery would fire a 20-minute preparation on known and suspected German positions along the eastern bank. Smoke would be deployed to obscure crossing sites from German observation. Infantry would make the initial assault in boats while engineers prepared pontoon bridge sections, and tanks would cross once bridges were operational to exploit the bridgehead and push German forces away from the river. It was textbook combined arms doctrine for forcing a contested river crossing. The the kind of operation described in field manuals and practiced during training. The difference, as every soldier who'd seen combat understood, was that textbook operations didn't account for chaos, fear, and random violence that characterized actual battlefield execution. Men would die during this crossing. That was certain. The only questions were how many and who, and those answers wouldn't be known until the operation was complete. At 1,345 hours, 15 minutes before the scheduled artillery preparation, Captain O'Malley gathered his company's tank commanders for a final briefing in a barn on Platling's western outskirts. The officers, young men in their 20s, some with months of combat experience, others still relatively green despite weeks in the field, stood around a map spread across hay bales, while O'Malley outlined a plan and answered questions. A lieutenant from 2nd Platoon, a tank commander who had joined the company only 3 weeks earlier as a replacement, asked the question everyone was thinking, "Sir, what's the estimate on casualties?" O'Malley paused before answering, knowing that false optimism would destroy trust, but that excessive pessimism could undermine morale before the operation even began. "We'll take casualties," he said finally. "The Germans are dug in, they've got artillery, and they know we're coming. But we've got artillery too. We've got air support on call, the weather clears, and we've got combat engineers who've done this before. Do your jobs, support each other, and we'll get across that river." Any other questions? There were no other questions because there was nothing left to ask. At 13:58, the officers returned to their tanks and prepared to execute a mission that would test whether the training and experience of the past months had been adequate preparation for what came next. The American artillery barrage began at precisely 1,400 hours with stunning violence that transformed the eastern bank of the Isar River into a landscape of explosions, smoke, and flying debris. Shells from 3 field artillery battalions, hundreds of high-explosive rounds, impacted across a 2-kilometer front, targeting suspected German positions in the woods, known artillery emplacements, and the destroyed bridges where German forces might have established observation posts. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous roar that made conversation impossible and forced soldiers to communicate through hand signals and prearranged plans. Smoke rounds began mixing with high explosive at 14:05, creating a dense curtain that drifted across the river and obscured the eastern bank from German observers. At 14:10, infantry from the 67th Armored Infantry Battalion began loading into assault boats. 16 men per boat, weapons and equipment secured, life preservers worn despite the awkwardness they created. A sergeant from one of the lead platoons, preparing to make the crossing, turned to the soldier beside him and shouted over the artillery noise, "You ready for this?" The soldier, barely old enough to shave, shook his head. "Hell no, but we're going anyway, aren't we?" The sergeant grinned despite the fear they both felt. "Yeah, kid, we're going anyway." The first assault boats hit the water at 1,420 hours, infantry paddling hard against the Isar's current, while German defensive fires began probing through the smoke, searching for targets they couldn't clearly see but knew were there. Machine gun fire raked across the water in long bursts, tracers visible even through the smoke, rounds impacting the river's surface and occasionally punching to the canvas sides of assault boats. One boat took multiple hits in the first 30 seconds, several soldiers wounded, but the rest kept paddling, closing the distance to the eastern bank. Artillery. Both American shells still falling to suppress German positions and German counter-battery fire seeking American gun positions, created a cacophony that reduced human experience to pure sensation. Sound, fear, the mechanical act of paddling, the desperate hope of reaching the far bank alive. A boat capsized midway across when its crew was hit by machine gun fire, soldiers spilling into the cold water, some managing to swim toward shore, others disappearing beneath the current weighted down by equipment they couldn't shed quickly enough. The boats that reached the eastern bank disgorged infantry, who immediately began engaging German positions with rifle fire and grenades, establishing a fragile foothold measured in meters, while engineers prepared to bring pontoon bridge sections across under fire. The pontoon bridge construction began at 1,447 hours under conditions that made every minute feel like eternity for the engineers of the 124th Armored Engineer Battalion working in the Isar River, while German machine gun fire and mortar rounds sought them out with methodical precision. A sergeant from the engineer company, His name not recorded and available after actual reports, but his actions documented, directed his team as they maneuvered the heavy pontoon sections into position, bolting them together while standing waist-deep in cold water that numbed legs and made every movement slower and more difficult. German fire intensified around 1503, when observers on the eastern bank apparently identified the bridge construction site through gaps in the smoke screen. Mortar rounds began impacting the water, sending up geysers that soaked the engineers, and occasionally scoring direct hits that destroyed pontoon sections or killed men outright. One engineer was hit by shrapnel and disappeared beneath the water, his body carried downstream by the current before anyone could reach him. The surviving engineers kept working, replacing damaged sections, maintaining the construction sequence, driven by training and the knowledge that infantry and armor on the eastern bank needed reinforcement desperately, and that the bridge was their only path to survival. By 1525 hours, American infantry had established a bridgehead approximately 150 meters deep on the Isar's eastern bank, but German counterattacks were developing and the situation remained precarious. A lieutenant commanding one of the infantry platoons that had made the initial crossing radioed back to the western bank at 1531. "We're holding but taking casualties. German infantry counterattacking from the north. Need armor support immediately, or we won't hold this position." Captain O'Malley, monitoring the radio traffic from his tank position on Platling's western edge, understood that the bridgehead was reaching its crisis point, the moment when inadequate reinforcement would lead to collapse and catastrophic casualties among infantry trapped on the wrong side of the river with no way to withdraw. The pontoon bridge was nearly complete, but not yet capable of supporting the weight of Sherman tanks. O'Malley made a decision that violated engineer guidelines but reflected battlefield necessity. At 1538, he ordered his lead tank onto the partially completed bridge, gambling that the structure could support the weight even though several sections remained unsecured. The Sherman tank rolling onto the Isar River pontoon bridge at 1,538 hours on April 28, 1945, represented both tactical necessity and calculated risk. The infantry bridgehead needed armored support to survive the developing German counterattack, but the bridge collapsed under the tank's 32 tons. It would block the crossing site and doom the operation. The tank's driver, operating on orders from his commander, moved forward at minimum speed while the entire vehicle swayed, and the pontoon sections flexed alarmingly beneath the treads. Engineers working on the bridge scrambled out of the way, some diving into the water to avoid being crushed, others shouting warnings that were inaudible over the noise of artillery and small arms fire. The bridge held. Barely. The tank reached the eastern bank at 1541 and immediately engaged German positions that were preparing to assault the American bridgehead. Its 75 mm gun firing high explosive rounds into woods approximately 200 meters distant where German infantry had been assembling. The appearance of American armor on the eastern bank disrupted the German counterattack before it could develop fully, buying precious time for additional infantry to cross and for engineers to complete the bridge properly before more tanks attempted the crossing. The German response to American tanks appearing on the Isar's eastern bank was immediate and violent. Anti-tank guns that had been concealed in Platling's eastern districts opened fire at ranges between 600 and 900 meters, engaging the exposed American armor with volume of fire that indicated more German defensive capability than intelligence estimates had suggested. At 1554, the lead American tank that had made the first crossing was hit by what appeared to be a PK-40 anti-tank gun firing from a fortified position near the destroyed bridge. The round penetrated the Sherman side armor, and the tank began burning, crew members bailing out under German small arms fire. 3 crew members made it to cover behind American infantry positions. 2 didn't. The gunner was killed while exiting the turret, hit by machine gun fire. The driver was trapped when the tank settled on uneven ground and the escape hatch jammed. Infantry trying to reach him were driven back by German fire, forced to listen to his screams as the ammunition inside the burning tank began cooking off and making rescue impossible. It was a kind of death that haunted soldiers for the rest of their lives, watching a friend die meters away, unable to help, the absolutely helplessness mixing with relief that it wasn't you burning alive inside a steel coffin. By early afternoon, around 1,615 hours, the pontoon bridge across the Isar was fully operational and American armor began crossing in strength. Shermans from a 46-tank battalion rolling across the swaying structure in single file, while engineers worked constantly to reinforce sections that showed stress damage from the weight. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor crossed with his command tank at 1623, establishing his forward command post in a captured German bunker on Platling's eastern edge where it could coordinate the expanding bridgehead and direct forces pushing deeper into the town itself. German resistance in Platling varied wildly from building to building. Some structures were defended fiercely by soldiers or SS troops who fought until they were killed or wounded too severely to continue, while others were surrendered by soldiers who had simply reached their limit and no longer saw purpose in dying for a war that was clearly lost. Captain O'Malley's task force, pushing through Platling's industrial district toward the town center, encountered both extremes within the same block. A factory building where German soldiers immediately raised white flags and surrendered when American tanks appeared, followed 30 meters later by a fortified house where Panzerfaust teams fought from basement windows until tank fire collapsed the structure on top of them. The afternoon of April 28 saw the 13th Armored Division expand the bridgehead beyond Platling itself, pushing eastward toward the town of Worth, where intelligence reported approximately 400 Allied prisoners of war were being held in a German facility. The drive toward Worth encountered German rearguard positions that fought brief, intense actions before withdrawing, a pattern that suggested German forces were conducting organized retreats rather than making final stands. At 1747, forward elements of the division reached Worth and found the POW facility largely abandoned by German guards, with Allied prisoners, British, American, French, and other nationalities, emerging from barracks in various states of health and confusion. A British officer, the senior POW based on rank, approached the first American tank to enter the compound and saluted formally despite wearing tattered clothing that barely resembled a uniform. "Captain Jeffrey Morrison, Royal Engineers," he said. "We've been expecting you lot. Bloody good timing. The Germans cleared out about 2 hours ago. Left us here. Probably figured you'd liberate us anyway, and it saved them the trouble of deciding what to do with 400 prisoners they couldn't feed or evacuate." The liberation of Worth's POW facility provided a brief moment of something approaching joy in a day otherwise marked by casualties and hard fighting. American soldiers sharing rations and cigarettes with freed prisoners who could barely believe the war was finally over for them. As dusk settled over the Isar River battlefield around 1945 hours, the 13th Armored Division controlled both banks of the river, had secured Platling and Worth, and had established positions that allowed continued operations deeper into Bavaria. But the cost of the day's fighting had been severe by the division's recent standards. Preliminary casualty reports indicated at least 18 soldiers killed in action, over 60 wounded with approximately half requiring evacuation to rear area hospitals, and 5 Sherman tanks destroyed with 3 more damaged but potentially reparable. Lieutenant Colonel McCullough, who had been wounded during the morning's reconnaissance, had been evacuated through medical channels and his condition reported as serious but stable, facing months of recovery from wounds that would end his combat service but spare his life. The engineers who had built the pontoon bridge on a fire had suffered proportionally higher casualties, 3 killed, 11 wounded, reflecting the extreme danger of their mission. The human cost of forcing the Isar crossing was being calculated in morning reports and casualty notifications that would reach families in the United States weeks later, reducing individual tragedies to statistics that conveyed tactical outcomes, but couldn't capture the experience of watching friends burn in tanks or bleed out in the Isar's cold water, while medics worked frantically to save lives that were already lost. Captain O'Malley, exhausted beyond anything he'd experienced in previous combat, established his company command post in a Platling building that had been a German municipal office before American forces occupied it. At 2,115 hours, he sat at a desk that still held German paperwork and wrote a letter to the family of the tank driver who had burned to death in the morning's fighting, trying to find words that would provide some comfort while being honest about how their son had died. "Your son served with honor and courage." O'Malley wrote, the phrases feeling inadequate even as he formed them. "He died quickly, alive but a merciful one, and did not suffer. His sacrifice helped save the lives of his fellow soldiers and contributed to our mission's success." O'Malley signed the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and added it to the stack of similar letters he'd written over the past weeks. There was no training for this part of command, no manual that explained how to tell families that their sons had died screaming inside burning tanks or bleeding out in German rivers. You just did it because it was your responsibility. And you carried the weight of those deaths for the rest of your life, because that was the cost of surviving when others didn't. The night of April 28 to 29th was relatively quiet along the Isar River as German forces withdrew eastward and American forces consolidated positions without attempting further advances in darkness. Guards were posted, defensive perimeters established, and soldiers who had been fighting since dawn finally got permission to sleep, collapsing wherever they stood and falling into the kind of deep, dreamless unconsciousness that comes from complete physical and emotional exhaustion. The Isar River continued flowing past Plattling, carrying debris from destroyed bridges, empty ration tins thrown by soldiers on both sides, and occasionally a body that had been missed during casualty collection and would wash up downstream for German civilians to find and bury. The pontoon bridge swayed gently in the current, engineers having reinforced it after the day's fighting to ensure it could handle continued military traffic. Somewhere in the darkness on the eastern bank, a wounded German soldier who had been left behind when his unit withdrew called out in German, asking for help. American medics heard him, located him after 20 minutes of searching through rubble, and treated his wounds before sending him to a prisoner collection point. War created these strange moments of humanity. Enemies saving each other's lives hours after trying to kill each other. Mercy coexisting with violence because soldiers on both sides were ultimately just young men trying to survive chaos they hadn't created and couldn't control. The morning of April 29, 1945, brought orders from Major General Wogan directing the 13th Armored Division to continue its advance eastward from the Isar River toward objectives deeper in Bavaria, maintaining the operational tempo that had characterized the division's combat operations since entering Germany weeks earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor, now commanding the task force after McCullough's evacuation, briefed his officers at 0630 on the day's mission, advanced toward the River, accept surrenders from German units that had lost cohesion and will fight, and be prepared to force another contested river crossing if German forces chose to defend the next water obstacle. The Isar River crossing on April 28th would be remembered in division histories as one of the bloodiest single days the 13th Armored experienced during the war, a forced river crossing against prepared defenses that cost casualties no final victory could justify, except to the cold logic that wars are won by accumulating such victories regardless of their individual cost. For the soldiers who had fought at the Isar, who had paddled assault boats under fire, built bridges while being shot at, watched friends burn in tanks, or killed Germans who were trying to kill them, the memory would persist long after the war ended, a day when the abstract concept of duty became concrete in blood, fear, and the simple act of continuing forward because orders demanded it and because stopping meant abandoning the men beside you who were doing the same. The advance eastward from the Isar River on April 29, 1945, began at first light with the 13th Armored Division moving through countryside that showed increasing signs of Germany's complete military collapse, abandoned vehicles scattered along roads, discarded weapons piled in ditches, and white sheets hanging from farmhouse windows and signals of surrender that had become so common they barely registered anymore. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor, now commanding Task Force Delnor after McCullough's evacuation the previous day, led his forces along muddy routes that wound through small Bavarian villages where civilians watched American tanks pass with expressions that mixed fear, exhaustion, and a kind of numb acceptance that the world they'd known was ending. A tank commander from the 24th Tank Battalion, standing in his turret as the column moved through one unnamed village around 0745 hours, later recalled seeing an elderly German woman standing in the rain holding a photograph. He assumed of a son or husband who wouldn't be coming home, and the way she looked at the American tanks wasn't with hatred, but with something closer to profound sadness, as if she understood that everyone had lost something in this war, and that victory and defeat were just different versions of the same grief. The tactical situation throughout April 29th reflected the chaotic final weeks of the war in Europe, with German military units fragmenting into three distinct categories that required different American responses. Organized units still conducting fighting withdrawals under competent leadership, demoralized groups willing to surrender at first contact, and scattered deserters who had abandoned military discipline entirely and were simply trying to reach homes or avoid being killed in. Meaningless final battles. Captain O'Malley's task force, pushing ahead of the main column toward the town of Vilshofen, approximately 15 kilometers east of the Isar, encountered all three categories within a 2-hour period starting at 0920. First, a German rearguard position near a crossroads that engaged American armor with anti-tank fire and withdrew in good order after a 20-minute firefight that cost 1 Sherman tank damaged and 2 American soldiers wounded. Then, 15 minutes later, a German supply unit of approximately 80 soldiers who surrendered immediately when American tanks appeared, their officer explaining through an interpreter that they had received no orders or supplies for 3 days and saw no purpose in fighting when the war was obviously finished. Finally, at 10:45, O'Malley's lead elements discovered 6 German soldiers hiding in a barn, wearing civilian clothes over their uniforms, trying to desert and reach their homes in villages nearby. They were disarmed, given prisoner of war status despite technically being deserters, and sent to collection points that were overflowing with similar cases. The approach to Vilshofen on the morning of April 29th brought the 13th Armored Division to the banks of the Danube River again, this time further upstream from where they crossed on April 27th, and reconnaissance indicated that German forces might attempt to defend the town and its river crossings despite the futility of such resistance. At 1,215 hours, forward observers reported German military activity in Vilshofen's eastern districts. Soldiers moving between buildings, possible anti-tank gun positions being prepared, and what appear to be demolition charges being placed on a remaining intact bridge across the Danube. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor, monitoring these reports from his command position approximately 2 kilometers west of the town, faced a familiar tactical decision that had characterized recent operations: commit forces to a potentially costly assault on a defended town, or attempt to bypass and isolate it while continuing the advance. The operational guidance from division headquarters was clear: maintain momentum, avoid becoming decisively engaged in battles that consume time and casualties. But the bridge at Vilshofen represented a valuable crossing point that could accelerate subsequent operations if captured intact. The decision was made for Delnor when, at 1,234 hours, the bridge at Vilshofen exploded in a massive detonation that sent chunks of concrete and twisted steel flying hundreds of meters and created a mushroom cloud of smoke and dust visible from American positions 2 kilometers away. German forces had demolished their own crossing point, eliminating any tactical value in securing Vilshofen quickly and transforming the decision from a difficult judgment call into a straightforward calculation: bypass the town, accept any surrenders offered, and continue eastward toward the river where intelligence suggested the next significant German defensive line might be established. Captain O'Malley, whose task force had been preparing to assault Vilshofen when the bridge exploded, felt a complicated mixture of relief that his men wouldn't have to fight through another defended town and frustration that German demolitions were complicating operations even as German military resistance collapsed. "They can't win," he said to his executive officer, watching smoke rise from the destroyed bridge. "They know they can't win, but they're still blowing bridges and making us work for every kilometer. I don't know if that's courage or stupidity at this point." The afternoon of April 29th saw the 13th Armored Division arc around Vilshofen to the south, encountering minimal resistance and accepting the surrender of several hundred German soldiers who emerged from the town carrying white flags once it became clear American forces were bypassing rather than assaulting their positions. A German captain, surrendering his company of approximately 120 men at 1,445 hours, spoke enough English to communicate directly with the American officers accepting his surrender. "The war is finished," he said, gesturing toward his soldiers who were stacking weapons in organized piles under American supervision. "Hitler is crazy. Berlin is surrounded by Russians, and we are ordered to die for nothing. My men have families. They want to live. So we surrender." The American lieutenant processing the surrender, a young officer from Ohio who had been in combat for less than 2 months, asked a question that had been bothering him throughout the pocket's collapse. "Why did you keep fighting this long if you knew it was hopeless?" The German captain considered the question before answering. "Because we are soldiers. We follow orders until we cannot follow them anymore. Today, we cannot follow them anymore. So today we surrender." It was an honest answer that captured something essential about military culture: The tension between duty and survival, between following orders and making independent moral judgments about when orders no longer deserve to be followed. As the division continued eastward through the afternoon and into evening on April 29th, the landscape of Bavaria began changing, becoming more mountainous as they approached the foothills of the Alps, and the weather deteriorated with heavy rain falling intermittently and temperatures dropping as elevation increased. The roads, already damaged by weeks of military traffic, became nearly impassable in some sections, forcing engineers to construct bypasses or lay corduroy roads of logs across muddy stretches, where vehicles would otherwise have become hopelessly stuck. Progress slowed to a crawl in some areas, columns advancing at walking speed or less, tanks throwing tracks in the mud and requiring recovery vehicles to pull them free, supply trucks struggling to keep up with combat elements that were operating at the end of increasingly tenuous logistical lines. A supply sergeant, whose name wasn't recorded but whose complaint was documented in unit logs, radioed back to division headquarters around 1745. "We're burning fuel faster than we can deliver it. Ammunition is adequate, but getting low on some calibers. Rations are short and the men are exhausted. Request permission to halt for resupply and maintenance." The request was denied. Orders from 7th Army headquarters demanded continued advance toward the Inn River and into Austria, maintaining pressure on retreating German forces and preventing them from establishing defensive lines in the Alpine regions where terrain favored defenders and where prolonged fighting might occur if Germans chose to make a final stand. The night of April 29th to 30th brought the 13th Armored Division to positions approximately 10 kilometers from the Inn River, the next major water obstacle and the border between Bavaria and Austria, where intelligence suggested German forces might attempt more serious resistance than they'd offered since the Isar River crossing 2 days earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor established his command post in a commandeered farmhouse and received updated operational orders from Colonel Russell at Combat Command A headquarters. The division would force a crossing of the Inn River on April 30th or May 1st, depending on enemy dispositions and bridge availability, would continue advancing into Austria toward Hitler's birthplace at Braunau, and would maintain operations until either German forces in the region surrendered en masse or explicit. Orders came down from higher headquarters to cease offensive operations pending final German capitulation. Delnor studied maps showing the Inn River's course and the terrain beyond, calculating approach routes and crossing sites, tried to anticipate where German forces might establish defenses and where American forces might be able to exploit weaknesses. But the planning felt almost academic at this point, as if they were rehearsing for a battle that might never occur, because the war could end before they reached the next objective. Captain O'Malley, gathering his tank commanders for evening briefing around 20-30 hours on April 29th, found it difficult to maintain the command presence and tactical focus that had characterized earlier operations. His men were beyond exhausted. They'd been in continuous combat or movement for weeks, had forced 2 contested river crossings in 3 days, had lost friends in the Isar fighting, and were being asked to prepare for potentially another river assault within 48 hours. One of his tank commanders, a sergeant who had been with the company since its activation and had survived more close calls than anyone could count, asked the question that everyone was thinking. "Sir, how much longer? The Germans are finished. Everyone knows it. Even they know it. Why are we still doing this?" O'Malley understood the question wasn't insubordination, but genuine confusion about why operations continue when the strategic outcome was no longer in doubt. "Because we have orders," he said finally, "and because until someone official tells us the war is over, German soldiers are still shooting at us, and we're still shooting back. When we get orders to stop, we'll stop. Until then, we cross the Inn River and we keep moving." It was an insufficient answer because it was no sufficient answer, but it was honest, and honesty was what O'Malley's soldiers trusted even when they didn't like what they were hearing. The final days of April 1945 saw the 13th Armored Division operating in a kind of temporal limbo, where the war was simultaneously ending and continuing, where mass surrenders occurred alongside fierce firefights, where soldiers died for objectives that would be meaningless within days or weeks. On April 30th, the division reached the Inn River and found the bridges destroyed but German resistance minimal, allowing engineers to construct crossings with far less difficulty than the Isar operation had required. On May 2nd, American forces entered Braunau, Austria, Hitler's birthplace, and established a command post in the house where the Nazi dictator had been born, a symbolic gesture that seemed to matter more to newspaper correspondents than the soldiers who just wanted the fighting to stop. And throughout these final days, the casualties continued accumulating. Soldiers killed by artillery fire from German units that were still following orders to resist, tankers dying when their vehicles hit mines laid by retreating forces, infantrymen shot during building-clearing operations in towns that would surrender the following day. Each death felt more tragic because the war's end was so obviously imminent. Each casualty more senseless because it occurred after the outcome had been determined but before the official orders to cease fire had been transmitted. On May 3, 1945, the 13th Armored Division established a bridgehead across the Inn River near the town of Marktel, prepared to continue offensive operations deep into Austria. When orders finally came through from 7th Army Headquarters, cease offensive operations, hold current positions, prepare for potential German surrender negotiations. The war in Europe would officially end 5 days later on May 8th with Germany's unconditional surrender, but for the soldiers of the 13th Armored Division, the fighting effectively stopped on May 3rd with the establishment of the Inn River bridgehead that would never be exploited. The Isar River crossing on April 28th, the bloodiest single day of the division's combat operations, the force assault against prepared defenses that had cost 18 American lives and over 60 wounded, would be remembered not as a decisive battle that changed the war's outcome, but as one of countless tactical actions in the war's final weeks, significant to those who fought it, but barely noticed in the larger narrative of Germany's defeat. For the soldiers who had stormed across the Isar under fire, who had built pontoon bridges while being shot at, who had watched friends burn in tanks or bleed out in cold water, for them, the crossing would remain the defining combat experience of their war, the day when abstract concepts like courage and sacrifice became concrete in the most brutal possible terms. What makes a river crossing deadly isn't just the tactical challenges of forcing a contested water obstacle against prepared defenses. It's the accumulation of small decisions and random chances that determine who lives and who dies, who makes it across, and who drowns in the current, who escapes a burning tank, and who gets trapped inside. When examining the Isar River crossing on April 28, 1945, what stands out is not the strategic significance. The crossing had minimal impact on the war's ultimate outcome, which was determined by larger forces that had already made German defeat inevitable, but rather the human dimension of soldiers executing orders to attack across a river, because those were their orders, regardless of whether the operation served clear strategic purpose or simply maintain operational momentum that higher commanders deemed important. The engineers who built bridges under fire, the infantry who paddled assault boats through machine gun fire, the tank crews who crossed on unstable pontoons to support embattled bridgeheads. They fought and died not for grand strategic objectives, but for immediate tactical necessities and for each other, the kind of small unit cohesion that makes soldiers advance into situations where survival seems unlikely. Does history adequately remember the operations that occurred in war's final weeks, when the outcome was no longer in doubt, but soldiers continued fighting and dying because official surrender hadn't yet been negotiated? And what did those soldiers carry forward after the war? Those who survived the Isar crossing and returned home to lives that seemed impossibly distant from the experience of forcing a river under fire. What understanding about duty, sacrifice, and the thin line between meaningful death and senseless tragedy? These questions matter because they remind us that wars don't end cleanly at moments of dramatic victory, but rather wind down through countless small actions where soldiers continue executing orders and accepting casualties for objectives that diminish in importance with each passing day until finally someone in authority declares that the fighting can stop, leaving survivors to process what they experienced and to wonder for the rest of their lives whether friends who died in those final operations gave their lives for something that mattered or for bureaucratic inertia that couldn't stop killing until the paperwork was properly filed.